But it's interesting, if you look at the story of Adam and Eve, they did something stunningly and spectacularly wrong. And what most of us maybe would expect them to feel for that is guilt. You do something wrong, you feel guilty. But it's not obvious from the account that guilt is what they felt. Before Adam sinned, Genesis tells us that the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Genesis 2:25. After the fall, it says, here they are, the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. See, what they felt was somehow deeper than guilt. It was somehow more fundamental than guilt. Not so much guilt as shame. And they felt the need to cover up, which is interesting because the English word shame, its original meaning was covering up, covering up. And this strange feeling that they'd never experienced before made them want to do just that. But even when they covered up with fig leaves, they still felt exposed and they still tried to hide from God. And when God asked them why they were hiding, Adam's excuse was, I was afraid because I was naked. So he even felt naked despite the fact that they'd used whatever they could find to cover up.
As you'll see in this session, we're not advocating that we all get rid of our clothes and become some sort of Christian nudist colony. God has a better solution than that. But shame is something that makes us feel so vulnerable that we do want to cover up and hide away from God and other people. So in this session, we're going to look at what shame is, where it comes from, how we typically try to deal with it, and finally, how God's grace can bring us out of disgrace and into freedom. The wonderful news is that by God's grace, we can come out of hiding and stand unashamed before God and other people. We can be just like the younger son who stood there before the Father, accepted, loved, and secure, in spite of all he'd done. In fact, if you can't quite yet identify with this picture of the Son in all his glory, but you feel more like a need to cover up or hide from God, it may be because shame is the reason for you. So, what is shame? Well, guilt and shame are two sides of the same coin in that they both drive us away from God. But they're very different, actually. Guilt says, I did something wrong. I made a mistake. As we saw in our last session, guilt is a legal condition of having broken the law of God and standing, well, guilty before the heavenly judge. Guilt is about what we have done. But shame is different. Shame says there's something wrong with me. I'm the mistake. It's the painful emotional experience that comes from believing that there's something very wrong, not so much with what we've done, but with who we are at the very core of our being.
If we go to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, we find somebody who's in that condition of believing that there's something very wrong with who they are, with them at the core of their being. Let me read it to you. And a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him and saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now this guy would have been a mass of ulcerating skin all over his body. I hope you haven't just eaten. He would have looked repulsive, smelt terrible, and he was actually on a relentless course towards a slow and agonizing death, because what leprosy does is it ravages your body, but then it goes on to ravage your mind. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, let me read you what God himself in his word said about this guy. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Leviticus 13. Now there are some very good reasons for those instructions from God, having to do with protecting other people from getting a hideous disease. But could you imagine in your daily quiet time turning to this passage and reading that about yourself? He is unclean. He shall live alone. Now, we may not suffer from that particular disease, but we can feel that we're somehow different to other people. That if people knew what we were really like, deep down inside, they wouldn't accept us. We can feel that we're somehow inherently unlovable, something wrong with us. We can feel that we're dirty, alone, contaminated, messed up, unclean. That is shame. That is shame. No wonder it makes us want to cover up and hide away. But this leper, against all the rules, he approached Jesus and he asked him a question. Now, if you had been that guy, what question would you have asked Jesus? Jesus, will you heal me? He didn't ask that. He asked something more fundamental. He begged Jesus to make him clean.
How did Jesus respond to that poor man? Scripture says, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. See, Jesus touched him and made him clean, but he didn't need to touch him to heal him of leprosy. He could have just said the word and he would have been healed. But I believe that Jesus needed to touch that man to heal him of all the years of pain from being alone and rejected. It makes you wonder how long it had been since that poor man had had another human being touch him or given him an embrace. You know, and that's exactly what Jesus wants to do for you today, to reach out to you, to touch you, and remove your shame.
That's right. So let's have a look, see if we can understand where shame comes from. And maybe the first place that shame comes from is being brought up in a shame-based culture. Now, all societies try to find ways of discouraging people from doing things that are not socially acceptable. Western societies, like the one I was brought up in, tend to use guilt for that. So we're pressured to conform by the threat of punishment. That could be a disapproving word or a raised eyebrow. At the other extreme, it's the law courts. It could be religious teaching that God will punish you if you do something wrong. That's guilt. But other societies, particularly Eastern societies, don't use guilt for that, they use shame. And control is maintained by creating a culture where if you don't do the acceptable thing, if you don't conform to the social norms, you yourself are unacceptable. And making sure that the way you behave is socially acceptable becomes the main cultural value in that kind of society. The fear of being rejected, of being ostracized, is a really powerful motivator. I came across the story of a missionary in an Eastern culture that helped me understand this. He was puzzled by something that he observed, and it was this. There was a divorced lady, she's a Muslim lady, and every morning her friend would come round to her house and would feel her hair to see if it was wet, to see if she'd washed her hair. And so the missionary was a bit puzzled by this. He said, why is she doing that? And he was told that it was so that the friend could tell whether or not the lady had committed adultery. He said, well, how does that work? Well, again, it was explained to him the religious belief in that society was that having sex makes you unclean. And that the way you get clean again is you have to have a bath and wash all your body, including your hair. Well, the missionary thought about that for a minute. He, like me, I think, came from a guilt-based culture. And so his train of thought was, well, if this woman is going to be disobedient enough to commit adultery, what makes you think she'd be obedient enough to the rules to wash her hair afterwards? And it was explained to him that he just had missed the point. It was completely inconceivable in that shame-based culture that she wouldn't wash her hair and her whole body after having sex, because her uncleanness would make even the ground she walked on cursed. So in other words, in that society, being in a state of ritual uncleanness was more unthinkable than actually committing adultery. That's the shame-based culture. And what matters in that kind of culture is being clean, being acceptable, particularly in the eyes of other people. It's not so much a question of whether what you've done is wrong or right, but whether what you've done is what others expect. And if you feel that you don't hit the mark, you experience shame. Now, you don't have to live in an Eastern culture to experience being in a shame-based culture. Some families are mini shame-based cultures. Some religious institutions Even Christian ones are mini shame-based cultures. A church leader or a parent may overuse words such as should and ought to make you feel that you have to behave in a certain definite way to be an accepted part of the church or the family, or maybe to be a good Christian.
I was a Christian at university in Guildford when, going to the Christian Union, all that sort of stuff. My boyfriend was back in Kent where I lived, and we were doing things we shouldn't do, and I got pregnant. I was feeling, ashamed really. It was very obvious to everyone what I'd done. Going to church, no ring on my finger. I tried to go to, an antenatal course, and it was horrendous because it was talking, as well as talking about the birth, they were talking about what you do with your baby afterwards. And I'd already decided that adoption was the right thing for me. So when I was back at home, I used to catch the bus in to see my boyfriend, and the bus driver knew me, saw me getting pregnant, and then when I wasn't pregnant anymore, we said, "So where's the baby?" It's like, well, I guess I didn't ever label it as shame, but I wanted to hide. I just did not want to be seen. I put on weight, I ate. Actually, by being larger, people don't look at you so much. And I think it's a shame not understanding that I could be free of that. I designed a stronghold buster, which for me was renouncing the lie that food would give me any kind of comfort, and announcing the truth that God's my comfort. And I did that for 40 days. And I didn't necessarily believe that anything was going to change, but the compulsion to eat was still there, and I couldn't control it. And then it just dissolved. And suddenly I could change how I wanted to eat. I could choose not to eat that stuff. I still look at a bag of biscuits and think, well, I could eat those, and I could just gorge myself on them, or I could not. And now I have a choice, whereas before I didn't have a choice. I lost about 35 pounds, 2.5 stone in weight, over about 6 months. And I've used the same principle, the 40-day stronghold buster principle, over and over again. I'm on buster 8 on my phone every night. There it is, telling me, helping me to sort of get rid of not just comfort eating, but all of the other patterns of hiding and, wanting to live in a way that's not glorifying to God. All the bad stuff that I've done that is a part of my life is gone because of what Jesus did. He sees me as he intended me to be, as he created me to be. So he sees me beautiful, he sees me acceptable, he sees me significant. Where I am right now